We're living at a time of fall of successful people. Government leaders, business leaders, religious leaders, sports figures, entertainment personalities, and the list goes on and on and on about people who have been in prominent positions, people who have been great leaders. Something has happened in their lives, and all of a sudden the truth comes out, and they can't bear the truth, and so what do? They make a public apology. Well, if I hadn't gotten caught, I probably would not have apologized. Maybe that's a part of the whole thing. But we do live at a time when there's so much of this that's taking place. We just read a story, or had a story read to us, about the end of Solomon's life. We don't hear very much about the end of Solomon's life, but it's an ignominious end. It's a bad end. Do you know that Solomon became an idolater, a worshiper of idols? Yes, he did. Sit down and read the story of Solomon, the whole thing. And we'll find that here is this great man of tremendous wisdom. The man who wrote so many proverbs and said so much about the practical aspects of life. And he left God. Oh, he was an illustrious character. He's mentioned in the New Testament as being such an illustrious character. But sometimes we forget that this man made a very tragic mistake and fell. One of the big mistakes that he made is he married too many women. He had 300 wives and 700 concubines. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? Stop and think. Back in the Middle East of that time, the whole idea of big harem that the king had, that was something that all of the kings had. They had access. Why? Well, because I'm the boss. I'm the one that decides. And so you give me whatever I want. Now, that's entirely contrary to biblical directives about the kinds of lives that we ought to be living. And yet it's so easy to get caught up into the thrust of society, what society is doing, and what society demands, and what society allows. That's the first thing you know, we lose sight of so many of the very, very important things of life. When things are sexual in nature, these falls are, well, that's his business, that's his life. Let him live the life the way he wants to. But now when public trust is involved, everybody rises up in horror about that. You know, as we read the Old Testament about the fall of the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, the fall of these nations of God, the fall did not come around because of the lack of public trust or the failure in public trust. It came about because of the moral degradation of the leaders. And the country followed the leaders. And so there are many ethical, moral failures of many people who have been successful leaders. I want us today to think in reference to the story in the Bible about a fellow named David. I really like David. He was spoken of in the very beginning of his career. He was spoken of as a man after God's own heart. You know, when Saul's kingship, when his rulership began to fail, God said to Samuel, Samuel, go to the house of Jesse. There's one there I want you to anoint as the new king, the future king of Israel. He says, I have found a man after my own heart. Wow. Isn't that a great statement? And so David was that man. He was the man who was chosen. He was a very humble fellow. He was just a young boy, a young man, out keeping the sheep, and the rest of the family, the rest of the boys and the men in the family came, and God said, no, that's not the one. And so Samuel says to Jesse, is this all of the sons you have? He said, oh, well, I've got one more. He's out keeping the sheep. As if to say, well, he didn't amount to very much, you know. He's still at work. He's just a young guy. We'll bring him in. And he was the one that God chose. We don't know who wrote the 23rd Psalm. The Bible doesn't really tell us. It's generally attributed to David, and I think in those terms myself. But I can imagine something here. And I want you to kind of join me in this imagination. Can't you see David out in the meadows away from home with this little flock of sheep, and night falls and David lies down. The sheep are taken care of now, and they're lying down there, they're sleeping, and David looks up and he sees the beauty of the heavens, and he looks at the sheep and he says, they depend on me. I take care of them. I lead them where the food is. I lead them where the water is. I have this little sling, and if a wild animal comes, I know how to use that sling and kill that animal to protect the sheep. Oh, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. That gets all over me when I think of that, because I think of what a great little man this fellow David must have been. Well, he was anointed. He trusted in God. And you know, when the time came that Goliath was such a challenge to Israel, David came by and said, I've got a little sling here. I can kill that giant. And he did, because he trusted. The giant said, you think I'm a dog? You come to me with a slingshot? Not really a slingshot, a sling. And David said, you're coming to me with a sword. I'm coming to you in the name of the living God. You see, David was a spiritually minded man. A number of times King Saul got jealous at David and tried to kill him. David was a man of great principle. David later had at least 2 chances to kill Saul. And the captain of David's little army said, why don't you kill this fella? You've got a chance now. Kill him. And David says, I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. And that was the character of this man. When Saul finally was killed, Saul died in battle. When that finally happened, David mourned the death of Saul. And when someone brought the news to Saul and wanted a reward for bringing such good news, Saul is dead, David had that man punished, because you don't brag about the death of God's anointed. Well, time came, David became king. And everything went right, folks. Just everything went right. He expanded the kingdom. He was a great general, a great leader of the army, and that's what kings did. They went out and they fought with their army, and they led the army, and that was a part of their job, to protect the nation. Well, everything went right. He was a good economist. He was a good job finder. Everything was going right, and the Bible even says that the people said that everything that David does is good. Wow, isn't that a reputation for a king to have? And then after he'd been king for a while, It seems that some things changed. Stop and think about this. The Bible says that at the time when the kings would go out to war, they went out to protect their nation. David stayed home. David stayed in Jerusalem. He was not minding his business. He was not taking care of what he should have been taking care of. He stayed at home. And we don't know why, but he stayed at home. And he saw he was on the rooftop of the palace, and he saw over there was a beautiful lady, and she's bathing. He went and said, "Bring that lady to me." Whoops. Bad decision. Bad decision. David is married. This lady, he has no business monkeying around with that. Bring this lady to me. She became pregnant by David. And then she goes to David and tells him about this. He says, uh-oh, we got to take care of this, that way. Where's your husband? He's out fighting the war. Bring him home. Bring him home. Okay, David brings him home and says, you want to find out how the war was going along? Now, why don't you go on home, spend the night there at home, and you can go back to the war tomorrow. Well, Uriah was his name, and Uriah didn't do that. He said, no, I'm not going to go home and enjoy being at home when my fellow soldiers are out there fighting for the nation. And so the next night, David brought Uriah in again. He got him drunk. And he said, oh yeah, well now he'll wander on in and so forth. No, Uriah spent the night outside. Well, how am I going to cover up this thing that I've done? He sent a note to Joab, who was the captain, and in the note he said, put Uriah, this is Bathsheba's husband, put Uriah in the heat of the battle. Ordinarily that meant right close to the wall of the city that they are fighting against, and the soldiers would have, good shot at him. And so they did. Then when you get him there, withdraw the army from him. Leave him by himself. Well, that's what Joab did. And then Uriah was killed. And David sent a note to Joab, his captain, and he said, don't let this bother you. Different people die in battle. The sword catches one, the sword catches another. This is no big deal. And then Nathan comes to David and said, Nathan was a prophet. David's kind of his personal preacher, so to speak. And Nathan says, David, I've got a story to tell you. We got a problem. What is it? Well, the rich man here had big flocks, just all kind of sheep and cattle and everything. And his neighbor was a poor man. He had just one little lamb. The rich man had a visitor come, and you know what the rich man did? He went over and stole the lamb, brought the lamb to his own house, killed the lamb, and fed it to the visitor. What do you think ought to be done about a guy like that? And David was infuriated. He said, that man ought to be executed. Nathan turned to David and said, David, you're that man. You're that man. And all of a sudden, David, it's out. Everything I've covered up, God knows about. Nathan then said to David something that was so tragic. He said, because you have done this, David, the sword will never depart from your house. There are consequences. Consequences of your actions, David. You are unfaithful, David, to your wife, to your nation, to your God. There are consequences that are going to come on you. Here is a man of great stature, a man of whom it was said, a man after my own heart, God said. And now he's fallen. Why? Well, A lot of things. Prestige, position, power. You know, when I get to a certain point in my life, and I think, well, I'm in charge of me now. I'm in charge of things. I'm in charge of my family. I'm in charge of me. I have power. Or in my job, I have power. I'm up here and the peons are down here, you know. I have power. And so that turned out to be the terrible thing for this man David. What happened? Well, David allowed his position to cause him to lose his sense of the sovereignty of God. One of the things I'm a good American, I'm a patriotic American, but one of the things that we make a big mistake in America is the idea that we are free people, free to live as we please, to do as we please. Yes, I understand the principle, but folks, don't allow that principle to separate you from the sovereignty of God in your life. God is the one who is in charge of your life, not your job, not my job, not my freedom, not my liberty under the Constitution. God is the one who is in charge of my life. If I lose that idea, I will lose my relationship to God. I feel so sorry for this guy, David, because he had such a wonderful, wonderful past. He was a compassionate man. He was a great economist. He put Israel on the map economically. He developed the country. He expanded the country. When people saw what he was able to do, they said, everything that king does, he's doing it right, boys. He's really doing it right. And so David he had all of these things going for him. And the first thing you know, somebody says, who's number one? Prior to that, David would probably have answered that question, God is number one. God is number one. God's in control of me. I will submit myself to God because I know what's right, I know what's wrong, and I'm going to do what's right, and I'm not going to do what's wrong. God is in control. Now, David rises. Instead of taking care of the business of the country and going out to war, he stays home. When he sees this woman bathing, instead of turning away, he says, get her. Bring her here. Well, you know, you were in the position of Bathsheba, and the king said, I want to see you. You would probably go. David had this affair with her. We don't know what all went on here, but we do know that there's something terrible that has happened in David's life where he had been such a devoted man, such a devout man, such a godly man, such a trusting man, such a follower of God. He had done all those things, and now all of a sudden here he is committing adultery. It was costly. Why did he do that? Well, I don't know. There are some things that I can suppose. With power and position and prestige comes a feeling of independence, comes a feeling of I have it my way. Whatever this was, David involved himself in deception, in corruption of his subordinates, in a willingness to compromise rights, forgot about what was wrong. He formed a plot to have a man killed. He totally disregarded the feelings and the effects that all of this would have on a whole group of innocent people? What? I want it my way. Sounds like Burger King, doesn't it? I want it my way. I want to do it my way. Yes, I know God says this. I know this is wrong, but I want it my way. And this is basically what was going on, I think, in the mind of David. And then when it all backfired, what does he have to do? Now we got to cover it up. Now we got to cover it up. We'll do something so that nobody will know about this. How do you do that? We kill the husband. Nothing will ever be said. Well, when David came to the point that he was willing to compromise, that he was willing to lose his devotion to God, lose his relationship to God, just for the sake of the satisfaction of his own worldly lust, when he did that, he lost it. There are so many statements in the Bible about men in great positions, men who had been good men, godly men, who were in high positions, and they come tumbling down. Pick up tomorrow's newspaper, and you'll see the same thing. And we talk about this. Oh, this is so terrible for this politician to have done. Here is a prominent sports figure who is now condemned, or accused rather, of murders. Here is another politician. Here's another business person. Here's another family man, whatever it might be. And the first thing you know, things are falling apart. Why? Why? Because we're leaving God out of the equation. Well, let me back up on that. No, we keep God in the equation, but he is placed in such an insignificant role that he's no longer the controller of my life. He is just one more influence. And when his influence is something that I don't like, then I set it aside. Folks, there's so many times when I say to myself, I know what I ought to do, but I won't. I know what I can do, but I don't. I kind of think that's where David was in just a whole lot of this. Did David not know that adultery was wrong? Oh, I expect he knew that. I know it, but I won't abide by it. I resist it, but I won't resist it. This sort of thing gets under our skin. And this sort of thing is something that, if we're not careful, we will sweep away and say, well, that's not really what my life is like. No, I'm not as faithful as I ought to be. I understand that. I'm not as attentive as I ought to be to the things of God. I understand that. But I'm not a bad person like David. Well, you know, there was a time when David wasn't a bad person either. But he kept going down the wrong road here. And the first thing you know, he abandoned. Ooh, that's a bad word. But that's what happened. He abandoned the principles of morality. He abandoned his relationship to God. Oh, for just a moment. Periodically. For just a little bit. But you see the consequences that it brought. You see what happened to his kingdom. The sword will not depart from your house as a result of that. That is such a horrible thing. The tragedy of this, well, the tragedies, plural, of this are many. Stop and think for a moment how the history of Israel, the biblical history of the Old Testament, would be totally different if David hadn't done what he did. It was Bathsheba who later, not with this pregnancy, but who later gave birth to Solomon. And because of Solomon's idolatry, God ripped the kingdom away from him. The whole history of Israel would be different if this man, one man, had stood for what is right. I don't know about you, but yeah, I do too. You're not in that position. I'm not in that position. But the history of a family, the history of acquaintances, how is my behavior going to affect my children? How is my behavior going to affect my community? How is my behavior going to affect the church? How faithful am I? How devoted am I? Can I look to others and say, live like I live? Paul said, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. That's what God wants out of us, folks. That's the goal of all of us. Yeah, we don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear that. I didn't even like it, and I didn't enjoy preparing this sermon, because as I was preparing this sermon, I was saying to myself, boy, I'm talking to myself. I'm preaching about myself. And when I preach this sermon, people are going to say, quit meddling in my life. I live my life. Yeah, all of this sort of thing. And yet, these are truths that we have to face personally, individually, so that we can come back to God and be what God wants us to be. Oh, there are a lot of interferences. There's entertainment that interferes with us. There's a job that interferes with us. There are public pressures that interfere with us. There are friends that interfere with us. There are ambitions that interfere with us. There are all kinds of things like that. God calls on us to be true and faithful and devoted to Him. And He gives us examples of what happens when we fail. No. This is not an enjoyable thing to think about. Here's something that Paul wrote to Titus. The grace of God that brings salvation has appeared unto all men. It teaches us to say this: say no to ungodliness and worldly passions. We got to learn to say no to temptation. Temptation to be unfaithful. Temptation to neglect. Temptation to fail to do when we could. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passion, and to live lives of self-control, of uprightness, and of godliness in this present age. That's the challenge that every one of us has to face. If you are not a Christian today, I implore you, set aside those things of life that are holding you away from the Lord. Become a Christian today. Become a believer, an obedient believer. Be baptized into Christ today. Be raised from baptism to walk a new life. We invite you to come. Let's stand together and sing.